Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Wheaton, Chief Policy Correspondent here at Politico Europe, and welcome to the 6th official edition of the Politico Healthcare Summit. We're here live at Auto World in Brussels, and for those of you watching online, I am facing an array of several dozen people, and it's so nice to see all of you, see all of your faces. Last year, we were here, but I was looking at an empty room, so it's great to have some company today. Of course, in some ways, things are not so different from last year. We're actually in Belgium now, entering what authorities are pretty much calling the fourth wave. Some slight new restrictions are coming back in. But at the same time, the situation is very different. We're well into vaccination. We're now talking about treatments. And we're talking about things that have nothing to do with COVID. Some of those things will include innovation and the pharma strategy more generally. The cancer plan. Remember Europe's Beating Cancer Plan, what we were all talking about right before the pandemic started. We'll also be talking about vaccines still, that conversations never ends, health data, and we'll have some exclusive interviews, one of which is coming up in just a few minutes. But first, I'd like to thank our leading partner, Janssen, for helping us be here today, as well as our presenting partners, Teva, Lilly, Viatris, and the Global Self-Care Federation. So before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. I want to encourage you to ask questions using our swap card platform. There are instructions about that on the event website. As you know, we love to have audience participation. We're taking the questions via swap card. And my consistent reminder to people is to get your questions in early. My colleagues and I, we all have plenty of our own questions. We could talk to all of our guests all day long. So, but if you wait until the very end of the session to ask your question, we might not get to it. If you're using your desktop, you can also submit questions at the bottom right of the screen or below the live stream if you're on the mobile app. And if you're in the room, then there should be instructions on swap card at your seat. And we encourage you to tweet at #PoliticoHealthcare. And now, without further ado, let's get to one of our exclusive interviews. We are here, joining us from Amsterdam is Emer Cooke, the Executive Director of the European Medicines Agency. Emer, it's great to see you. At our summit last year, which was a little bit later in the year, you were just days into the job, and we just had very early data about vaccinations, so things have changed quite a bit since then. And now, in fact, the conversation is about boosters. And I'm really interested to see the conversation play out a little bit differently on different sides of the Atlantic. And so I want to kick off by touching on that. The US FDA has authorized boosters for older age groups, for people at high risk. We saw yesterday the Swiss regulator make a similar call with regards to the Moderna booster. We've seen the European Medicines Agency give a broader green light to these boosters. Can you help us understand why, using the same data, we're seeing these regulators reach different conclusions?
So thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here, and I'm really sorry that I'm not in Auto World joining you, or at least looking at the audience today. I'm still here in Amsterdam, almost 1 year on. And yes, we have been working a lot on the booster issue. As I'm sure you're aware, in early October, we recommended a booster for the Pfizer vaccine 6 months after vaccination. And then just Monday, we recommended a booster for Moderna vaccine, again, for the general population over 18 years. Now, this is very consistent with the way that we would normally provide a recommendation on a booster for any vaccine. We would look at the totality of the data and then the studies that were done and see what they support in terms of a regulatory output. And that's how we have looked at it from the European side. This doesn't mean, this gives the flexibility for national healthcare systems to use it in different environments, depending on what the status of vaccination is, what they're seeing from an epidemiological perspective, and the availability of the different vaccines as well. So I don't think there's a fundamental difference in the way we approach it. I think it's the recommendation that we have given from the EMA perspective is a recommendation that can then be rolled out depending on the different environment in Europe.
I take your point that national regulators are still totally free to make their own call, but while France and Germany have, very strong regulatory structure already, and they have plenty of their own experts who can make those decisions, one of the arguments about EU-level regulation, whether it's for drug approvals or for health technology assessment, is that some smaller countries don't have that same infrastructure. So might some of those countries be the ones that need a little bit more guidance from the EMA?
So absolutely, and this is what we hear all the time. Particularly from the smaller member states, that they are really waiting to see what the outcome from the EMA perspective will be. And we see that as a very, very important role for us. But we're looking at the data that's submitted to us, and the data is submitted to us across the general population, and this gives us the confidence to recommend to indicate that the immunity will be increased in the general population.
And we've heard reports from the US that there was quite a lot of conflict and misgivings as far as actually voting to approve these boosters. Within the EMA, within the CHMP, behind the scenes, was there that same level of debate, or did it kind of slide through on a consensus?
I think one of the strengths of the European system is that this is a debate that takes place at expert level. It's not about a discussion at member state level. It's really a debate at expert level, and there will always be differing views, more on the fine lines than on the actual final recommendations.
So can you share with us what maybe an example of one of those fine lines where there was some debate within the panel?
Well, it's the Committee for Human Medicines that is providing the recommendation on this, and of course, I'm not as executive director, I don't participate in the scientific discussions, but I have an excellent chair and vice chair of this committee who orchestrate the debate. So let me just point to one of the things that has been a bit challenging, and this is the emerging data on myocarditis and pericarditis. This is something that we included in the label for the 2 mRNA vaccines back in July. But we're continuing to look at a range of different studies that are actually, they're showing different outcomes in terms of the overall incidence of myocarditis and pericarditis following vaccination. So this is something that was closely looked at during the evaluation. And in fact, it's ongoing. We have our Pharmacovigilance and Risk Assessment Committee today. They're continuing to look closely at these signals. There is a Nordic study that has come out with some observations. We've also looked at studies from the US, also studies from Canada. So we put it to the experts to look at the totality of the evidence and tell us what that means in the context of the use of both the initial vaccine and any booster. But I think it's important to clarify that even if there is a lot of attention on these side effects at the moment, they're still very rare. We're talking about incidences in the 10 per million. They're not common side effects. I think it's very important to point that out.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's a really interesting update on the data that you're using to monitor that. And of course, those questions of myocarditis in especially in younger people, is something that the people are concerned about with regard to vaccines for young children. Do you have a sense of the timeline for when we might see a decision on first doses for young children?
Well, so we have just let me give you a little bit of an update on the way we approach evaluation of data in children. So the first, we have a pediatric committee that advises on the type of studies that would be needed to include different populations in different what we call pediatric populations. So we've already given a recommendation for the adolescent age groups for both mRNA vaccines. And we've just received an application for the 5 to 11-year-olds for the Comirnaty vaccine. I think we started the review on the 18th of October, and we put about a 2-month time frame on that. We're expecting additional information to come in November, and this will help the committee to come to a conclusion on this age group.
Thank you. And my colleagues may be aware of this already, but I'm seeing on my iPad some people in the chat saying that their stream is not working. I'm not seeing questions load on my iPad, so if somebody wants to come collect it from me and check, that would be great. I'm told that the live stream problem is solved, but my iPad question problem is not. Always tech challenges throughout this virtual and hybrid era. But speaking of sort of virtual meetings, yesterday it was possible to watch the U.S. FDA to watch their vaccine advisory panel have their discussion about whether to approve vaccines in young children. And I'm wondering if this has been considered at the European Medicines Agency. Should there be a bit more transparency to see how these decisions are made?
Yeah, so this is something we have the possibility to have what we call hearings, open hearings on some very well, how would I say? So the possibility exists in our legislation, and we've had 1 or 2 open hearings on safety issues. Normally, our committees meet in camera. We do allow, or we do have participation of industry groups, of patient groups on specific issues. But the meeting normally takes place in camera. But we have a provision to allow for oral hearings, and in fact we have a wonderful auditorium that allows us to do that. But we've only used it, I think, in 2 situations so far.
Right, and I know that indeed the EMA has held some public hearings for drugs where there's been some patient concerns, some things about problems that people might be having with it. But it sounds like it's just not even up for discussion whether to open up a chimp discussion to the public.
I wouldn't say it's not even open. I think it's not currently foreseen, but I think we're becoming more and more transparent all the time. So if this is, we can explore what the possibilities are.
Got it. I want to leave a good chunk of the conversation to non-COVID issues, but I'll just do a few more. I got to ask, what's the latest on Sputnik? How are its prospects for completing the process?
Well, it's our policy not to discuss products that are under evaluation. So I can tell you it's under evaluation. Also that we were hoping to do an inspection earlier in October, and that had to be cancelled, and that's put back the review time a little bit. But we're still reviewing the data.
Was that cancelled by the developer or by the European Medicines Agency?
It was cancelled. It wasn't cancelled by us.
Okay. Got it. One last COVID question. So long COVID, it's something people are very understandably very afraid of. It potentially affects not just the older people or people with pre-existing conditions who we know are very vulnerable, but everybody is aware of that threat. Is there anything in the pipeline for long COVID? And how is the process for assessing a treatment for a condition that's still pretty poorly defined and understood?
Yeah, very good question. I think this has been one of the challenges all around COVID. I mean, this is a disease we knew nothing about 2 years ago. So there's still a lot we don't understand. There's still a lot we're trying to make sense of, for want of a better word. At the moment, we have 10 or 9 therapeutics under review at the moment. They're not focused. They're not focused on treatment of long COVID, but they do show promise in various aspects of the of treating people with COVID at different stages. And I think one of the other things, because long COVID is, in a way, it's the treatment of COVID at a different stage. One of the things that we have very clearly learned that there's no one treatment that will address all stages of the disease.
Got it. And a good question from the audience. I apologize to anybody whose name I mispronounce. Fons Cajus has asked, what lessons drawn from the pandemic will be used in regulatory processes post-pandemic? A very broad but important question.
Yeah. So it's an excellent question, and of course, it's a question that we keep asking ourselves. We have a work ongoing on lessons learned from the pandemic, even though it's still in process. We've started a reflection where we've come out with 10 areas to focus on. We're doing this together with the European Medicines Regulatory Network. And just to give you a flavor, 2 of the areas that we're planning to focus on through workshops and looking at how we can do better, both now and in the future. The first one is in resourcing, so how we ensure sustainability of the system to allow us to deal with what is essentially a peak activity that we weren't prepared for. So that's an area that we're looking to see how we can streamline some of our processes, make them more efficient, improve the planning, so that for example, one of the problems that we've had is we assign people to work on a particular dossier, and then there's some glitch, which means that then they're on hold and they can't immediately then switch to another dossier, which makes the whole process less efficient. So thinking about more innovative ways of planning, procedural aspects, improving or training additional expertise and that can be brought into the system That's another area that we're looking at. And then the second workshop, and this is, I said there were 10 issues, so I'm just telling you that two of them here just to give you a flavor, but of course we'll be publishing this as part of our normal procedures. But the second workshop will be looking at communication. So communication with all our stakeholders, including healthcare professionals, patients, consumers, but also with the health policy bodies in the different member states, and also with our individual medicines regulatory networks.
And looking specifically at the rolling review process, are you seeing elements of that will be used in the future? And what has the pandemic taught us about the use of real-world evidence?
So let me start with the rolling review. So I think the rolling review process has been extremely beneficial for us to move very quickly, particularly on the first 4 vaccines that we authorized. One of the challenges that we've seen on the later submissions is that sometimes the information is premature, and it's really not at the stage, even if we start to try and assess it, it's not at a stage where we can really put in place a timeline to deliver confidently on the evaluation. And I think this is something that we're going to have to consider outside of COVID as well. If we want to use concepts like rolling review, how do we make sure that we prioritize? How do we make sure that we don't waste, because they do take a lot more resources. So how do we make sure that we don't use the resources inappropriately on things that are less promising or less mature? So these are some of the things that we're looking at in the context of the lessons learned. So I would say, yes, probably a limited use of rolling review, but in highly prioritized products where there's a good chance of a success, and it will make a difference, because that's what there's no point in allocating everything to rolling review if in the end it doesn't make a difference. And I think the challenge for us is selecting those products where it will make a difference, and where there's a real public health need as well. On the real world evidence, I have to say that this is something that we have invested a lot in, even before COVID, of course. You'll have heard about the Darwin EU and the work that we're doing on real world data, but we have been able to use this very, very effectively in the context of COVID. And the frameworks that we put in place for collecting data, particularly on safety, but also we'll have a possibility to do more work on effectiveness, really help us to build the story about the real world consequences of the data. And I think one of the areas where we could do better is really trying to predict some of these questions earlier. Now that we have the mechanisms in place, can we predict some of these questions and ask them earlier so that we get the feedback, and then we can feed those back into the regulatory system, rather than waiting until the problem emerges, and then we need to see, well, what is the incidence across different age groups? Can we collect that data prospectively?
And another area where real-world data is important is in health technology assessment. And so I'm gonna zoom way out to kind of a bigger, philosophical question, or sort of a purpose question. There's always been this tension between approvals and decisions about how well a new therapy works against an older therapy, or compared to the existing standard of care. And some people think that this should be baked into the approval process, that we shouldn't allow expensive new drugs that while they might pass a risk-benefit comparison, they don't actually stack up necessarily that well compared to what we already have. Without necessarily weighing in on what may happen in the next year or whatever, or even during your tenure, what is your view on what the right relationship between approvals and health technology assessment should be?
So, yeah, it's a very important question. And in fact, with the new HTA regulation, it's really the right time for us to be getting this right. I think, I started as a medicines regulator back in 1987, and we would never have talked to health technology assessment bodies. I'm not even sure if how much they existed at that time. But what we've done in the meantime is try to build mutual understanding, because what we want in the end is that any products that we have a positive opinion on, that they actually reach the patients. And to do that, we need to. It's important that the type of evidence that a health technology assessment body or a payer might need is addressed as early as possible in the process. And that's part of the work that we did on doing parallel scientific advice with health technology assessment bodies. In the new regulation, which will come into effect at the end of the year with a 3-year transition time, there is a provision for joint scientific assessments. And I think the key thing here is to increase mutual understanding, to try to figure out what sort of evidence would be needed, and whether that can be done. That can be done as part of the primary clinical trials rather than sequentially after the regulatory requirements are completed.
Got it. And another in the closer term future, what are the non-COVID issues that you are most feeling urgency about tackling?
So, well, yeah, we have, of course, COVID continues to be one of our primary concerns, and we're dedicating a lot of resource to the evaluation, but also the post-authorization changes involved in many of the COVID products. And I'd like to just talk a little bit about this, if I could.
Please.
But next year we'll have the coming into force of the veterinary medicines regulation. We'll have the coming into force of the clinical trial regulation, which is dependent on the clinical trial information system that we have been pivotal in helping to put in place. We have a network strategy together with the Commission and the medicines agencies across Europe, where we look at areas such as innovation, availability, supply chain, sustainability, and of course health threats and antimicrobial resistance. So we're prioritizing some actions to address this strategy. And of course, we have on the legislative table, we have an extension of our mandate, which timing of it is not clear at the moment, but it gives us extensive new responsibilities in crisis management and preparation.
Right, and on that note, I understand that one of the things that's become a sticking point in institutional debates. I was reading in our morning healthcare newsletter this morning, plug for that a digital shortage database is something the Parliament wants to see that the other institutions are not so excited about. Do you have strong feelings on whether that gets added to your mandate?
So I think, so first of all, let me be totally clear that we are very pleased that management and mitigation of shortages for critical products is added to EMA's mandate, because we saw how important that was in the current pandemic, and we didn't have a formal role at the time. So we're very pleased that the informal activities that we've put together to help manage and mitigate the shortages that we saw due to lockdowns, due to sickness, due to problems in ICU, we get a formal role in within the extended mandate. I think the issue that we struggle with is the complexity of what the solution might be. And I think we're a little bit burnt by having had in legislation some very detailed technical requirements from an IT perspective that then go quickly out of date, but very difficult for us to work with because they're actually in the legal proposals. So our priority is to ensure that whatever measures are put in place for us to manage and mitigate critical shortages can be built upon our existing systems and interoperable with the systems in member states.
Yeah, so plea for a bit of flexibility technologically within whatever new legislation ends up affecting you. Another forward-looking question. You've been in your role for a bit less than a year. We've seen some other changes among senior leadership, or some that are on the way. Noel Watian, the deputy executive director, has recently retired. What are plans for filling his role, and how do we see kind of some of the other? How do you think a new generation of leadership at the EMA will leave its mark?
So we have been, sadly, we've lost a number of long-standing members of our staff, mostly from retirement. And we have, I would say we've got a good mix of new and less new leaders now who are working together with me on our leadership team. Noel had been with us with the agency since almost the very beginning, and he played such an important role across many different areas that he almost had a position created for him. So what I've done since Noel's retirement is to appoint Ivo Claassen, who is our head of the veterinary division, as the deputy executive director, but not give him all the roles that Noel was carrying out. And then, for example, he's working on deputizing in my absence, but also on cybersecurity. But for example, Melanie Carr has taken over some of the crisis management activities that Noel was doing. So I'm actually very pleased with the leadership team that we have. I think it's been a bit challenging working remotely or in a hybrid manner, and we've only had the opportunity to have one sort of team building exercise since we started, but I'm looking forward to building on those relationships, and I see us as a very. I was going to say I don't want to say that a very collaborative, because we are very collaborative, but I actually think that the fact that people feel that they can challenge each other and are really trying to find the best solution for the organization it creates a very healthy dynamic. So I'm not somebody who likes agreement all the time. I like a little bit of challenging, so that we really do think outside the box and look at how to do things differently.
Well, thank you, Emer. I think that's a perfect note to end on, because it really captures the complexity of the task ahead, whether that's incorporating nuanced data on myocarditis for booster shots in younger people, whether it's dealing with these new tech challenges, whether it's thinking about how to incorporate more flexibility into the EMA's workforce to prepare for pandemics ahead. So thank you for discussing all of those points with us today. And hopefully next year we will be physically together in Brussels for this discussion. Thank you so much. We'll have our next panel. I will be hosting it. Along these same lines, is Europe ready for the next crisis? So stay tuned for that in just a few minutes.